Welcome, everyone. Asha, thanks for being here. Above everything and beyond everything, thanks for being here. Straight up, Asha Best is creating some of the most remarkable and effervescent work around. Asha is an urbanist and curator who works at the graduate program in geography at Clark University. She's a member of the steering committee of our lab here in Turin, and has been a key instigator, enabler, and theorist of Black urbanism. She coordinates an Urban Studies Foundation-funded seminar series on methodologies for just urban futures, and she's going to be presenting some of that work today. Now, we're not going to talk about the value of Asha's contributions to the field. For why do we always have to begin these gatherings with relative measures of worth, with a list of publications too long to enumerate, which is the ingenuous conceit of an academia that measures everything, which is the ultimate market of proportionality and settled scores, which has little sense of measure as in the interplay of James Brandon Lewis's Eye of I or Michel Ndegeocello's omnichord reel. And who is the we here gathered at this table? Something troubled and troubling and getting into trouble all the time. And as Asha reminds us, no matter the we, for Black urban residents, here come the police, over the hills and everywhere, pretending that they respond to a call, to a mission, rather than being deeply implanted in the very concept and apparatuses of academic endeavors. I'm sure Asha's been told many times, we need you to speak. We need you to tell us about the worlds you have come from, to tell us about ourselves so that we know where we have gone wrong, so that we might recalibrate and fix things in our own way. We need you to be relentless, to not shy away from difficult matters, and that within such critique, we may believe ourselves always to remain important, particularly in the ways in which repentance deludes and repeats the priority of our own reflections. So the question is not what to make of Asha Best's history of refusals of this demand, the vigils, the testimonies, the banter of dollar cars, and the flapping garments of Brooklyn specters. For as Olivier Marbouf has asked, how do you listen to those who refuse to speak at a moment decided by those who had decided that they wouldn't speak before because they didn't have anything in particular to say that others couldn't say in their place? Rather, the point is how to live without recognition and the multiplicity of pathways this refusal perhaps opens up. Nostrand Avenue to Bedford to Gates, back to Utica, onwards to Franklin. But hey, we don't want to miss Flatbush at dusk. Who says we don't know where we are going, and who's going to have shit to say if we don't? Asha doesn't mince words, but there's a larger, more complex recipe here. For though she speaks for no one but herself, which is everything besides what we might ask her to be or think she is, she exudes an awesome respect, a stuttering, even a sudden swerve or a holding things in reserve, distributed though it may be across many hands in stories that she has yet to meet or hear, which are enabled anyway to take places at the table we had thought reserved for ourselves. So in listening to Asha, something is always set in motion and always brought finally to a well-deserved rest. There will be no passing in the sense of signs of eligibility, of dissimulated respectability, of crossing some finishing school line. But her work well knows that diviners on the move always cross things never anticipate, always risk passing out. Asha Best's work is risky. It takes chances. And it is not by chance that at many finishing lines, the purported eagerly awaiting audience backs off, snowflakes out. But hey, Ma, look who's at the back door. Look who's looking down from the trees, up from the mangroves. Look who just walked out the front door, who don't need our house. Welcome to this encampment, Asha Best.
That was for sure the best introduction that I will ever have. I'm fairly certain in the entirety of my career. As we get set up, I just want to start by thanking Michaela and Malik, obviously, for the invitation to be in conversation with you all, and Kiara for helping to arrange the logistics of this visit, and all of you for being here, both online and in person. It's really a privilege to be here, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share with you a bit about my work. What I'm going to present today is based on a relatively new project on urban policing that I've been working on in collaboration with my colleague at Clark University, Lyndon Estes, but it's also produced in collaboration with a team of researchers with whom I have the pleasure of working, and some of their names are on the slide. So for context, while I've been doing research on policing over the past several years, this project that I'm thinking through today came about as a response to the 2020 uprisings and the spectacular scene of police violence that many people witnessed, the death of George Floyd, but also the deaths of Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, and others. In the wake of the uprisings, we began to think about how to create an intellectual space where we, as folks in a geography department, and for my colleague geoscientists, could engage in more action-oriented dialogue and research around the topic of police violence. The team thought through a broad set of questions that frame my talk today. Namely, how do we get beyond studying the where of police violence and instead begin to see, or to make more visible, the broader patterns of resource and surveillance distribution that comprise state violence? And so as many academic projects come about, this one sort of stemmed from my frustration about our tendency to end up cataloging police bias and holding policing intact versus using the vast tools and methods and resources available to us to sort of unpack logics that undergird policing. So again, thinking with the question, how can we see the broader patterns of resource and surveillance distribution that comprise state violence? Our goal is really to shift from the where, who, and how much of policing, so tracking who gets policed more and where, to talking about how policing works and what sorts of policing practices and changes over time and space matter to understanding the persistence of policing and police violence. In conceptualizing our research, we took as our starting point the intersection of several strands of scholarship that I'm just going to name check here, including studies on the militarization of cities, which is slightly different than military urbanism, but I'm naming those as sort of one and the same today. Neoliberalism, urban governance and racial ordering, development, displacement, and the future of the Black city. And of course, resistance against anti-Black racism as a frame, as an intellectual frame, for understanding the histories and futures of Blackness in the city. I just wanted to turn this so people can do that. Thank you. So we took from these different strands of research, and our project is also shaped by scholarship on long histories of surveillance and racialization, the rise of digital data and computing technologies in the making of the carceral city as well. A central question for us as an interdisciplinary team working across different spaces of geography, urban studies, and my own background in cultural studies is how do we put different tools and analytical methods to use to help us understand the prevalence and practices of policing? And specifically, how do we use the work of geovisualization and geospatial analysis to work on policing? I want to begin to unpack this question, keeping in mind the many critical interventions that shed light on the ways in which the complexities of Black life fall outside of the sorts of data and analysis that undergird geospatial projects to contemporary policing, and perhaps geospatial approaches altogether. And here I'm thinking with the work of Simone Brown, Brian Jordan Jefferson, Catherine McKittrick, and others. So again, how do we see the broader patterns of resource and surveillance distribution that comprise state violence? How do we employ geovisual tools for this purpose? Today, I plan to discuss these questions by introducing 3 case studies. They're really experiments with geospatial analysis and geovisualization that we've been developing over the past year and a half. And this is really a different approach for me because I'm not a geospatial scientist or really a geographer, but as an interdisciplinary scholar, I'm always interested in questions of how the visual and modes of visual analysis might open up different possibilities and spaces for inquiry. The goal of our research is to build a publicly available toolkit with data, maps, and other visualizations and guides that can be utilized by both university and community-based activists and researchers. This project is very much inspired by and intended to be in conversations with projects like forensic architecture, the anti-eviction mapping project, and I believe that there's a forthcoming counter mapping project that I think is being conceptualized by Carrie Freshour, who's at Georgia State. Much of what I'm going to show today is based on preliminary geospatial and geovisual analysis, but I'm happy to say more about what some of these images mean and their implications in the Q&A, and also about how I see this translating into other types of curatorial work. We got a problem. No? We're good, we're good.
Yeah.
So the talk works through 3 early experiments that are all connected, but which hopefully each pose different questions for policing and urban studies. And before I jump into those experiments, I want to talk about a number of conceptual and practical challenges that came up as we started the project and as we continue with the project, challenges that prompted interesting conversations amongst our research team. The hope is that if there's someone who, so heads up, this is a methods talk. So the hope is that if there is someone who hopes to conduct similar research, that this talk makes the process as transparent as possible. So the first set of challenges that we had to do with what data we would use to begin to probe these questions. This is a data taxonomy exercise that we did both as a group and individually that I can speak to more in a moment or in the Q&A. So while state and local governments aren't always forthcoming, there's no shortage of evidence to tell us about police violence in the US context. But we also wanted to think about the mundaneness and prevalence of policing in addition to acute and recognizable forms of violence. So a public murder via chokehold. Of course, one of the biggest obstacles to thinking about policing is that police practices are highly variable across cities. So we began with case studies of 6 cities in the US, mid-size and larger cities, different urban contexts, and some programs that are unique to particular municipalities in San Francisco, Chicago, Detroit, Baltimore, New York, and Kansas City. I won't be talking about all of those today. Primarily, the work that I'm bringing out today focuses on New York and San Francisco. But again, I'm happy to answer additional questions. And we began to try to get a sense of what is out there in terms of publicly available data on policing. So this includes, but isn't limited to, data on police spending, municipal budgets, surveillance technology such as CCTV cameras, data on 311 calls. Those are calls for service. I can say more about that in a bit. Crime statistics, which there's a lot to say about conflating crime and policing, right? So at least in the US context, if you Google data on policing, what comes up is crime. And so I'm very weary of that conflation between crime and policing. Not included in this sort of emerging database that we're building is data on what sorts of research funding has been supported in the area. Federal research funding has been supported in the area of policing. Secondary readings on other sorts of surveillance projects like aerial surveillance programs, and the deployment of surplus military equipment to local enforcement agencies, to municipal enforcement agencies. We also included information on zoning data and property values, and I'll talk more about how we use that in a minute. The data compiled comes from open source databases. So in the US context, again, city and state open data portals, civil society, and community-based data. Police reporting, data sharing, and data transparency across even these 6 cities, again, highly variable, and we're still working to sort of standardize that as best as possible. Much of the publicly available data that we found was on surveillance technology. So in some cases, we had to create the data. We found that some of the basic information that we wanted to find, however, was considered by the state to be tactical information, called so by the state. So for example, based on what we know, a lot of police time is structured around parole. That wasn't wrong. Patrols. These patrols are based on beat maps. So officers are assigned to a particular beat. So there's lots that we don't know, for example, about police density, right? Like how many officers patrol a given neighborhood regularly. And we wanted to know just how to get a hold of that information, but this, along with other forms of information, is considered tactical. And so I'm going to earmark, again, the use of language here. And I think that this is deeply embedded in the shift towards military urbanism and the militarization of cities. Again, different strands, happy to talk more about them. In the future, I think it would be really interesting to work with the sort of more difficult data, the data that isn't tractable, and opaque data. And I'm happy to think through this with the group during the Q&A. But in the attempt to take a geospatial approach, we needed to figure out how to map police presence without that sort of accounting. So a lot of what I'm going to talk through today answers the question, what serves as a proxy for policing, right? So if information is withheld from you, how do you account for police presence in a particular neighborhood? A lot of researchers work with reported crime and calls for police service, and I'll tell you why. Calls for service is, and again, some of this will sound really basic, but I think it's really useful to understand the terms that we're using with before we move forward. So calls for service data is data cataloged in a law enforcement agency dispatch system in the US, and these are called 311 calls or 311 data. They use the time, most researchers use the time that it takes to get a call, right? So for the officer to get to the call as a way to figure out who's in the area. So a lot of people use 311 calls as a proxy for policing. So you can also use GPS data, other forms, but mostly for GPS police data, you would have to work with police units, and this project does not do that. So the latter, reported crime and calls for service, conflates crime and criminality with policing, which I mentioned earlier. Not to mention, it betrays what racialized communities know about how policing is experienced every day, which is that police encounters do not simply occur when you call or when there is an originating call or event. Beyond police tactics, we also began to ask what might emerge when we pay attention to how and where resources are deployed. Again, I'll speak more about this later, but we wanted to know if we could visualize the relationship between policing and urban crisis by identifying connections between budget allocations, monetary flows, and shifts in policing practices, and whether we could make visible the ways in which changes to zoning and land use overlap with those periods of crisis, and shifts in policing presence and tactics associated with economic crisis. So in other words, how do you make crisis visible without using pictures of poor people's lives and even our struggles as evidence of that crisis? In other words, we ask whether municipal budgets, planning proposals, planning documents, and real estate data might be used to visualize the relationship between policing and the sorts of property logics that underpin racial capitalism, or as Huda Taya articulates it, the spatial contours of racial capitalism. In August 2022, with funding from the Urban Studies Foundation, we hosted a summer institute titled Methodologies for Just Urban Futures. We gathered 15 scholars and practitioners from 7 countries, including India, Brazil, Sudan, Germany, Canada, and the United Kingdom and the United States. And we were joined by Erin McElroy and folks from Forensic Architecture. The gathering was a remote gathering, and the goal was to think about the sorts of methods that are available for thinking about state violence and policing, in particular municipal policing. We quickly admitted, if we hadn't already done so silently, that many of our methods didn't easily translate to other geographical contexts. This is important. And that those problems of translation, again, some of which I'll mention later, were really useful actually for thinking about regimes of state violence and how policing works. So we learned a great deal from that, And from there, we've been playing with different methods, questions, and forms of information as we try to make sense of the project overall. And so what I'm going to talk about today is US specific, but with implications for how we think about geographical and urban context. The first set of experiments that we've done have been centered around working with risk terrain modeling. There are risk models for all sorts of things, but many of my colleagues who study, let's say, climate change and land use and land cover change will be familiar with risk modeling. For our purposes, we're interested in the use of risk terrain modeling in predictive policing models. So predictive policing is generally understood as a support tool. They use crime reports, demographic information, and urban features to identify areas of high crime risk. They are widely used to inform policing, particularly during times of perceived resource scarcity. So let's help struggling police departments be more efficient by telling them exactly where the crime is and exactly where to go, and exactly what time of day it happens. We'll talk about that in a moment. So risk is, for us and for me, a crucial category of analysis in understanding how policing works, and perhaps one of the most important mechanisms linking processes of racialization, urbanization, and policing. Put another way, risk instruments are not only embedded in the production of racial difference, in practices of land speculation, and in contemporary policing procedures, risk instruments mediate the relationship between all three. Risk is a social category. This isn't my language, it's borrowed from many other scholars. But when I look it up, it says a couple of things in the dictionary. A situation involving exposure to danger, a possibility of harm or damage against which something is insured, and then the possibility of financial loss. In the case of the urban, and in the case of studying Black urbanism, it's important to ask what kind of social category then is risk. Risk is a lens through which we can study up or see like the state. Focusing on risk is also a useful way to get beyond mapping the where of police violence and to create a project around how policing works using geospatial analysis, as we intend to do. As I mentioned, geospatial analysis already offers ways of ascertaining and visualizing risk for the purposes through risk modeling. And as geospatial scientists have produced risk terrain models for the purposes of predictive policing by municipal law enforcement, well-meaning GIS scientists are always producing these sorts of things for the state, we knew that there were models that we could use as a heuristic for the purposes of our projects. So for this first stage of the project, which is exploratory, we're using a predictive modeling software designed by researchers in the School of Criminal Justice at Rutgers University called Risk Terrain Modeling, or RTM. Again, it's intended to make policing more effective and efficient, and the model uses inputs to determine where crime is most likely to occur. Predictive policing models such as this one have been well critiqued, and rightly so. However, many of these critiques tend to focus on the matter of racial bias and the lack of transparency. So what goes into these models? And this has to do with the fact that it's often difficult to see the algorithms that generate these models and the data that are fed into them. I want to take up Catherine McKittrick's call to notice how algorithms have a place and take place and produce place. So in this case, we're thinking about spatial production through risk terrains. So rather than critiquing the model for bias, we already know that they are biased, or as Brian Jordan Jefferson puts it, searching for the racist dimension of the state's algorithms inside of its computing architectures, we instead hope to use the model as a starting point for visualizing how changes in the character and landscape of a neighborhood impact its presumed risk level, and thus the likelihood of heightened police presence. So in other words, in this phase of the project, we're using risk terrains not as measures of potential crime, but as proxies for police presence. They're future predictors anyways. So again, something that we were trying to get at earlier. I think it's worth noting that risk as a social category and as a way to organize policing has a long history. Some of this I learned from Simone Brown's work, but I also gained a lot from Elizabeth Hinton's work, from the war on poverty to the war on crime. In terms of the sorts of practices that are recognizable today, much of this way of sort of organizing police behavior around risk really takes shape in the 60s. This is when we see the 1965 Law Enforcement Assistance Act, and the creation of the Office of Law Enforcement Assistance, and the growing language around future crime. So this office supported training and experimental surveillance techniques for police forces serving low-income urban communities specifically. One New York congressman says during one of the initial hearings on the 1965 Law Enforcement Act, we must fight crime today, and at the same time, we must prevent the growth of tomorrow's criminal. That's how I feel, and thereby protect the future safety of our own children and grandchildren. The Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Street Acts passed in 1968. And we also see at that time in the US, the emergence of the National Institute of Justice. The Safe Street Act makes tens of millions of dollars available to researchers, to private companies, and to public organizations who could develop technology, hardware, and theories that would help the federal government prevent future crime. So there's a lot that we're saying right now about predictive policing models. This has a longer history. It's actually quite old technology, and Brian Jordan Jefferson has showed us this in his work as well. This is also the first time that we see preventative detention. So the practice of detaining a suspect without bail for up to 2 months is introduced for the first time in US history. Wiretapping and no-knock raids are also introduced in this period as well. We also see the emergence of what's called the high impact program and the designation of a number of high impact cities, so where crime is rising. Except that when you look at the data on these, on those sort of historical high impact cities, they have relatively low crime rates, right? So those are cities like Dallas, Portland, Denver, and they're designated at that time as high impact cities. So why is that? Because at the time, their Black population had increased in part due to the availability of manufacturing jobs. So at the same time that we see a sort of increase in Black populations, we also see the emergence of high impact cities. So you also had cities like Newark, New Jersey, Cleveland, Baltimore, Atlanta, and St. Louis, really Black cities marked as disadvantaged and therefore high impact cities at the same time. What really starts to change over time, and so I'm like most academics, wary of calling things new, but what really starts to change over time is that risk and value come to have new entanglements. So through looking more closely at how predictive policing works, I believe that we can begin to demonstrate what Rivka Jaffe refers to as speculative policing, which is an experimental, future-oriented form of policing that connects crime prevention to other forms of negotiating urban risk and uncertainty. These modes of policing are applied primarily in areas of the city seen as having the most potential for commercial development. So as Jaffe argues, speculative policing combines the risk management of future-oriented policing with an interest in unlocking the potential of real estate. So this is what we're seeing that might be potentially new that we might be able to get at a little bit through risk terrains. And again, we know that they aren't intended for that, but certainly we can put them to good use. So our work right now is to do the work of visual storytelling, using speculative policing as a frame, because it's an incredibly useful framework for thinking about how revised practices of racial ordering, urban restructuring, and policing come together, not only in the making of contemporary cities, but in how future cities are imagined and planned. This, of course, has real consequences for how we study Black urbanism. I remember, I don't know if I was a graduate student or a brand new baby faculty member, but I remember stumbling across this quote from Malik from a piece in Iger, in which he writes that the Black resident or Black district exists as a residual body, a body as anachronism in real processes of urbanization, where urban users are not coherent entities, but shifting fields of probable actions, data sets, risk calculations, credit ratings, genetic profiles, and shifting lifestyles. And so I suspect that future iterations of our research will make the sentiments of this quote more visible and prove it to be more true. So I want to get into a little bit of these experiments that we've been doing. So what I'm showing here is the first risk terrain map that we ever made, that we were able to generate using this risk terrain model. And as I mentioned, we collected a wide range of publicly available municipal and demographic data on 6 case study cities. In beginning to learn our way around risk modeling, we focused on one borough in New York, Brooklyn, where a lot of my other research has been. And we ran 2 models based on crime records from 2007 and 2008. So this is a really specific risk model that you're looking at. And so given that these are actually some of our first experiments, these maps are full of useful mistakes and viable lessons that I'm going to touch on a little bit. So the first thing to note that you'll see is that apparently all of Brooklyn appears to be a site of relative risk. Brooklyn is just a risky place to be in 2007. The neighborhoods adjacent to Flatbush and East Flatbush, like Crown Heights and predominantly Black neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and Bushwick, seem to be deemed the most risky, right? And so you'll see the red splotches are the sort of most risky areas. And so based on my ethnographic and archival research in which I witnessed and recorded stories of hyperpolicing in the area, this really isn't entirely a surprise. But it is worth noting how sort of tightly knit this corridor of crime is supposed to be. So apparently, most assaults that are ever going to happen in Brooklyn are going to happen in in Bed-Stuy, Crown Heights, Flatbush, East Flatbush. These are all Black neighborhoods, or they were. So what interested me is this tight corridor of high-risk areas. So one thing to note is that the software asks the user to select the specific neighborhood features around which a particular crime is most likely to occur. So what that means is, if I'm a particular stakeholder, if I'm a police officer, if I think that a crime is most likely to occur, I can input particular building features and build the model from there. So this is kind of an important thing to note. So while we tried to include neighborhood features that existed in both 2007 and 2022, that's kind of difficult, right? Like we know the rapid pace of gentrification. And so this project maps 2007 crime data onto 2022 urban features, which can distort what risk looked like in 2007. So I just want to also name that. Even with these distortions, there seemed to be a pretty clear designation of which neighborhoods were deemed as most risky. To adjust the map as best we can, we're going to be using archival data to alter the landscape within the model. So we want to add and remove environmental features that may not have existed in 2007. So grocery stores, fast food spots, community centers. So in our next test run, we're also going to focus on property-related data. In this first iteration, we use reported data on assaults because it's one of the most complete data sets provided to us by the police. That said, we're really interested in how this map changes as we focus on different data. So in this case, different features of the urban environment. So for example, this software identifies potential crime areas by doing an inventory of what I've called urban features. So mapping their density and their proximity to each other, they come up with some calculation that we can't see. They assign weights related to their assumed relationship to crime and modeling which configurations are most likely to attract crime. So bus stops, ATMs, et cetera, et cetera. The developers of this model offer a list of suggested place features ranging from everyday sites, such as ATMs and bus stops, to sites of sociality. So men's barbershops is something that you can actually select. Bodegas is something that you can actually select. Nail and hair salons is something that you can actually select, and laundromats. So this is a kind of specific type of neighborhood that we're talking about, and you can select these types of place features. So taking a more speculative approach, we might ask whether and how the model comprehends the sorts of sites and experiments that fall under the category of Black popular placemaking or Black urbanism. This would require making our own environmental features to see how Black urbanism is described within the world of this model. This might reveal something about how Black urban worlds are ultimately made commensurable through categories of risk and policing. So only when they are sort of put through these models do they become commensurable and legible to these sort of state actors. It will seem common sense to researchers that particular neighborhoods are deemed more risky than others, but we found something that we knew, but also didn't quite expect to find. For the purposes of building our toolkit, we honed in on the neighborhood of Bedford-Stuyvesant in Brooklyn, New York, which I and many others know as Bed-Stuy. Bed-Stuy is a model neighborhood for thinking about gentrification in the US city. And so what you're looking at is just a sort of glimpse from a block in Bed-Stuy on the left, 2007, and on the right, 2020. It's experienced major demographic shifts, rental increases, and development. And you can see some of the sort of changes in zoning right here in the images. So what we did was we just used Google Street View to start building comparisons with neighborhoods over time. And the reason why we did that, again, is because if this is a publicly available toolkit, we want to make some of the information as easy to find as possible for folks who are trying to replicate this research. So that's why we use Google Street View. So we found that property values have increased tremendously, right? We had to check our data when we found that the value of single family homes and duplexes in Bed-Stuy has increased by over 500% between 2007, just before the financial crisis of 2008, and 2020, just before a number of quarantine schemes impacted housing. So in both 2007 and 2020, I'm gonna get a little bit in the weeds here, but then I'll try to explain. So at this point, you're looking at all of Brooklyn, and the white splotches are what our model predicted would be high risk areas for crime. So what we found, again, the thing that we sort of knew but didn't really expect to find in this model, is that the predicted high risk areas had substantially more commercial and elevator equipped real estate, as well as public facilities and parking than areas identified as lower risk. Let me translate that, because I think sometimes the language gets so boring that our eyes gloss over. More expensive neighborhoods are deemed more risky. So this has tremendous implications, right? The assessed values of the properties that we looked at were all well above average in the high risk areas, whereas the same types had below average values outside of the high risk areas. And so this is zooming in a little bit on Bed-Stuy. And again, those sort of white splotches are presumed risk. Risk terrain models don't figure in property values. So we overlaid those property values with high risk areas. So what this really means is that over time, we're likely looking at the association between gentrified neighborhoods and predicted risk. So more valuable means more risky. Predictive policing makes it so that there are actually many possible worlds and futures for the city. And so as I was talking to, so for me, this is like a gotcha moment. I'm like, we found it, eureka. And my collaborator is like, well, we would need to run many models. And as a person who thinks about the speculative, I'm fascinated by the fact that there are many different models that might direct police behavior, many different versions of the future city that they can compute. So this is a sort of speculative, this is the speculative nature of the test that's like sort of most interesting to me. So there are at least 3 things that I think we could do with this and ways to think about this. So we can look at whether or not this is true by comparing these risk predictions to police activity, right? To validate the model, to use it as a proxy for policing. The second thing to do is to think about the boundaries of these risk areas. So if what we're looking at is actually gentrified or gentrifying neighborhoods, then will police activity be directed to police the boundaries of these things? And is that a way to think about where and how policing will work in the future? That's useful information for us to know, given that police presence is tactical information. The third, I think it could be staging public interventions. I worked with a group called Equality for Flatbush. It's an anti-gentrification and anti-police repression network, which established no eviction zones. So we might think about these zones as spaces for speculative interventions, no policing zones. In any case, this is useful for us to broaden and also revise our questioning, to look differently at how policing and urban change are linked, how and whether we might think of police operating in times of perceived growth and scarcity, right? So how do we think about what's happening year by year and how risk moves and changes? That's now what the model is telling us. For now, we're using this to shed some light on what is otherwise considered tactical information. For example, as I mentioned, while many urban residents and activists not only report, but often document through photographic evidence the pervasive presence of police officers in their neighborhoods, it is sometimes difficult to ascertain information on density. And so we could use this to ascertain that information on potential police density. There's a second part that I want to speak to before I move to our second set of experiments. For this particular risk modeling software, one of the things that we were surprised to find is that risk terrain models are meant to be supplemented with what they call temporal heat maps. So in addition to seeing where predicted crime might happen, one of the benefits of this model is that you can also supposedly see what time is supposed to be most crime-ridden in a particular place, part of the day. So we use some of this information to create basic heat maps. This is intended to help track crime shifts over days, times, or even a year in a particular city. So here's an example of a temporal heat map based on San Francisco data from 2007, broken down by district and time of day. Since we're still exploring the capabilities of this software, we also created a heat map for 2008, but we would be interested to see what happens to these maps in the years following the 2008 housing crisis. Users of the software are encouraged to create multiple maps to not only locate hotspots, but particular times of day when certain crimes are most likely to occur, which we presume can then be used to create a time lapse of a day. So again, I get excited about these things because I'm not a geospatial scientist, so I don't have to run the models and I don't have to sit next to them, and I know that they take a long time. And so I said, Eureka, we found it again. And my collaborator said, why is all the crime happening in the afternoon? We were pretty certain that this could be a marker of when cops change shifts. So again, I think this is a useful proxy, right? How do we look at these spikes as telling us something about where police are, rather than necessarily what crime is happening in a particular area? So again, if these sorts of data, which we know are often under and over-reported by the police, which is why they are unreliable, are driving police practices, then we feel comfortable using this data as a proxy for police presence and as ways that municipal police are thinking about risk and place. So I want to move on to case study 2, our second set of experiments. So our second set of experiments have been centered around illumination. In this case, the use of satellite imagery and nighttime data as another entry point for capturing police practices. Initially, I posed the question to my research team of whether we could use remote sensing to look at how sites of Black inhabitation and gathering are illuminated, and how we might draw on Simone Brown's work on Black luminosity in our own research. We started with the question of whether or not we could use satellite data to visualize state responses to the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, which we know through media accounts and in some cases observational knowledge were met with a heavy militaristic response. There were some things that made this difficult at first, namely that to do that through geospatial analysis would require place and location information that we didn't quite have at that time, and that these protests happened in sometimes heavily lit urban areas. And there are also some particularities about capturing light and light at night that made that initial inquiry kind of a challenge for us. So My brilliant collaborator started by using standing rock as a test. So for those who are unfamiliar, I'm referring to the struggles around the Dakota Access Pipeline, the crude oil pipeline, which took place on and around Standing Rock, the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in North Dakota in 2016. What was happening there was that they were attempting to run the pipeline under Missouri River Reservoir, which members of the tribe said would jeopardize the primary water source for the reservation, and construction would further damage sacred sites near the lake, violating tribal treaty rights. So this protest was sort of prolonged. Many of you will know about it. It went on in a really visible and highly publicized way over the later months of 2016, culminating in a pretty violent standoff between protesters and state actors in November of 2016. My collaborator suggested starting with Standing Rock because it was a more discrete time frame and because of its location, right? So it isn't a brightly lit urban area, so we could get a clearer read on what was actually happening there. So if you look at the 3 tiny little dots that are on this screen, what you're looking at are protest campsites, the locations of which we got from reading media accounts. So we could pinpoint pretty clearly where protesters were doing their work. So you'll see that what's ticked off right here is sort of average light, 2012, 2016, right? So what does light normally look like over a 4-year period at night in this area, around this encampment? It's a rural area, not much happening. But using satellite data, we saw this place light up between November and March when the encampments were cleared. So we're pretty sure that what we're looking at here through this nightlight data is the military response to the protesters. So we could see clear patterns of illumination, which then went away some months later, right? So we looked at this over time. We could see clear patterns of illumination, which we believe represent the clearing of that Standing Rock site. This confirmed for us that we could use satellite imagery to ask different questions. And this is an image from Standing Rock. So we turned our attention to how we can detect light around other types of features, particularly in urban areas. And the easiest one for us to get into was New York public housing. Right, so like discernible building type that we could see using the information that we had. And so again, for anyone who's interested, we use imagery from NASA's Black Marble satellites, didn't know we could do this, to estimate average nighttime brightness in New York between 2012 and 2021, so over a really long period of time. We used US Census data and public housing and building maps for New York. We calculated the population density and volume of buildings. We controlled for population and building structure, and we then compared the average brightness of the areas with and without public housing. When I say we, I mean my partners who are GI scientists. I eagerly awaited the results. We found that for nearly all population and building volume levels, areas with public housing are more brightly lit than those without. Although other factors may play a role, so for example, there are fewer trees, these differences may indicate a greater presence of surveillance lighting. Just for comparison, we also looked at San Francisco and Boston. However, the density of public housing is lower, no doubt related to both the lack of public housing, the destruction of public housing in the US, and the absorption of subsidized housing into a voucher model. So it's harder to see. So this is not only a useful methodological note, but speaks to the particularities of policing and housing across different cities. In the US, the lighting of public housing has become a hot topic, a topic of interest because of a program called Omnipresence. In 2014, under Mayor Bill de Blasio, this program called Omnipresence was introduced to selected neighborhoods throughout New York. Right? They're not even subtle with the names, Omnipresence. It included over 100, I think 140 new floodlights, specifically around public housing and public parks, and increased public presence. And so while the program is being touted by municipal actors as low cost and effective, we also know that the level of the light has incredible health effects on those who have experienced that level of illumination day in and day out. Like so much of what we do, what we study, this type of tactic, forced illumination, dates back at least to the use of lantern laws when Black and Indigenous people were mandated to carry lanterns in urban New York as a form of population management. But I'm also really fascinated by other explorations of light. And I was going to play this video for you, but I don't think we have time anyways. I can talk more about it. There's an artist by the name of, a Parisian artist by the name of Kapwani Kiwanga, who charts the history of light as a form of surveillance in the exhibition Off Grid. And she actually takes the aluminum from old police lights and turns it into part of the exhibition. It's a really fascinating project. What was most interesting to us was that this use of light and sensing became a way to study policing also outside of the US context. So remember earlier when I said that some of our work just doesn't translate, this is one of those instances where we found a really interesting overlap. So for the one scholar who worked with us during the Summer Institute and is working in the context of the Sudan, we're not only policing, but also urban data, and the urban itself and data look very, very different, right? She talked through the fact that their police response is very militarized. There is no open data. There is a really strict penalty for sourcing this sort of data and information. Thinking about illumination seemed really quite generative. After all, the US uses this type of information all the time to look at other state practices and other state actors. So it could be a useful collaboration for us to think about using illumination to look at state violence and interesting municipal policing practices outside of the US context, and studying specifically highly militarized encampments. So the last experiment that I'm going to touch on is mapping monetary flows. And this one we've actually gotten the least of the way with, but I think I've probably thought the most about it, even though we've done the least in terms of mapping. So budgets and money also became a hot topic. Many people have been studying flows of money for a long time. But I think it really came to the fore with the defund movement, which has a long history. For some reason, I think people think it started in 2020. It was revived in 2020, probably taken more seriously in the US than it had been previously in 2020, and now looked at as absurd again. But it articulated with the movement for Black lives in ways that were really powerful and that turned our attention to city budgets and the allocation of resources for policing. So I want to take a detour a little bit to how and why I think about money. So I came to thinking about budgets and resources through a really, I think, different entry point than defund. I came to thinking about money through police settlements. So in 2014, as I was conducting my own doctoral fieldwork and also conceptualizing a chapter of my dissertation on informality, mobility, and surveillance, Eric Garner was killed by the police in Staten Island, New York. And that loss really intervened upon my own thinking. For those of you who are not familiar, Eric Garner was approached in a public space by officers of the NYPD, New York Police Department, on suspicion of selling loose cigarettes, so what are called loosies. He told the officers that he was tired of their continued harassment, and because he did so, he was tackled to the ground and placed in a chokehold that caused a loss of consciousness and eventually his premature death. Video recordings of his death were widely circulated, and the words that he uttered as he died, "I can't breathe," were repeated on a constant loop. His death became really spectacular, but in constantly circulating that encounter in news media, in turning "I can't breathe" into a rallying cry, there's a lot that gets reduced. In a separate piece, I try to I use Black redaction as a, what Christina Sharp calls Black redaction, as a method to attend to those various testimonies of urban residents about that day and to juxtapose fatal police encounters with sort of narratives of everyday life. But that's a separate project. But I want to just sort of name that here as another cornerstone moment or cornerstone loss for this project. So it's one of the more sensational cases around which public dialogue, collective grief, and community organizing coalesced. There were these rather cruel debates after he passed about whether his weight, he was a robust person, would have eventually killed him. So whether or not he was more susceptible to dying because of his body mass, and whether he died at all because of asphyxiation, even though we watched as he did. So there were these mass protests, as there were in 2020. There were calls for indictment and conviction of the officers responsible for the death of Garner. The family and the city of New York eventually reached a settlement agreement for $5.9 million. His daughter died just a few years later. In very few instances have these settlements, these large payouts, impacted departments to the point of dissolution. And departments that have dissolved are typically in smaller cities and towns. And yet there's been this sort of exponential growth in settlement awards. So in 1999 in the US, the record high for settlements was $40 million across the board. So across the US, they were like, well, we've hit a high. We've paid $40 million this year for police brutality claims alone. Most recently, the most recent publicized, highly publicized case of police brutality in the US centered around a man named Randy Cox. He was paralyzed following his arrest. His settlement amount was in the amount of $45 million. So we are celebrating this as the largest in US history. I wanted to know how cities can claim to be in debt and continue to pay out large settlements. And I can talk more about that project, but that's a way that I've been thinking about monetary flows, value, and risky lives. Again, they don't seem to affect police budgets in any real way. So if what we're trying to get at is a sort of proxy for policing, my question is whether or not we can use budget allocations as a proxy. And so how does policing look and work in areas with higher property values and tax revenues? So what we started to do really centers around San Francisco. And at the moment, the city is in another crime panic. So if you ever have the displeasure of reading news from the US about the police and about crime, right now there's a sort of heightened sense of insecurity and precarity, right? Businesses are leaving. This is, I think, being attached to, if not simply blamed on, opioid addiction. Various things are happening in sort of city center. So it's an interesting place to think. And at the same time, there is a sort of persistent narrative, which is actually a lie, that we have defunded the police. So what we've started to do is look at the relationship between police budgets and tax revenue in the city of San Francisco, which has seen a dramatic increase in the price of real estate in the past several decades. We've done preliminary research on how the overall city and police budgets have changed in relation to shifts in the assessed value of real estate. And we're sort of doing this in a prototype, which I'm going to show you in a minute, by mapping changes in property values between 2008 and 2021, and charting how these changes vary between the city's different police districts. So again, let me translate a little bit. What we're trying to see is, if you live in a neighborhood where there's a high tax revenue, if you live in a wealthy neighborhood, are there more police in your neighborhood? Where are the police allocated, right? This is why police density kind of matters. So what we're trying to do is see if we can use budget data to get at some of that information and to get, again, at some of these underlying logics. In San Francisco, it might be helpful to know that the value of property has more than doubled in each of San Francisco's 10 police districts, with the Tenderloin district increasing more than fourfold, right? So there's real money in terms of property values happening here. Similarly, budgetary increases have altered how the San Francisco PD operates, for example, by increasing total staff. So what we want to do, I think, moving forward with this case study, which again, this is the sort of the one that we've made only small steps on, but which I think has a lot of potency in terms of the information that the public information that people are able to get on budget data and how they're able to use it. And we want to gain a deeper understanding of how such budgetary gains translate into operational changes, right? So how does this interact, for example, with risk predictions? And so we see ourselves putting this together in a more integrated way moving forward. So currently we're prototyping our toolkit. And I just want to reiterate the focus on methods in this talk and why it has mattered for me. So sort of delving deeply into these particularities and using language that municipalities use, that state actors use, has been really helpful for me in sort of in grounding the project. We want to bring this together, though, in a way that's usable, like I said earlier, to multiple actors and sort of hopefully beyond the academic sphere. So this is some of what we're dreaming up with a design team called Partner and Partners. They're a fantastic firm. And so hopefully what we'll do is we will share all of the data that we have available. We'll also hopefully make it possible for folks to add to our database so that we begin to sort of broaden the information that we have around policing. We also want to provide tutorials on how to collect publicly available information and how to do this sort of analysis that we're doing in other contexts, so that you don't need to sort of do it in an academic context. And by we, again, I mean my collaborators, have written really useful scripts for this that we're going to be adding to the site as well. So this is how our database might look, and we're also going to add tutorials to it as well. And so finally, this is also a storytelling project. So a lot of what I've showed you today has been the sort of behind the scenes. I think GIS, are there any GIS folks in the room? Okay, good, I'm not offending anyone. I think GIS maps are probably really ugly, right? And so then there's this other layer of making them beautiful, making them palatable. So what you've seen is the sort of behind the scenes. What are we actually seeing when we do the analysis? And what we want to do is sort of translate this into a different type of project that's also more user-friendly. But it's been important for us to go through the actual analysis to see what we're actually seeing on the ground and to make sense of this. I want to stop here for now because I'm fairly certain I've gone well over time. But in the Q&A, I'd be happy to answer as many questions as I can. Some of it is beyond the scope of me and better left for my collaborators. And I'm also happy to talk about how I see this lending to other curatorial projects. So thanks for listening and thanks for hearing these experiments. And I'm also really interested to get your feedback on, a little market research. If you were using this, what would be useful to you, right? So, so what makes sense for this sort of project to come to fruition? So thanks again. That's all I have for today.
Thank you.